The following is a debate between Ben Shapiro and Destiny, each arguably representing the right and the left of American politics, respectively. They are two of the most influential and skilled political debaters in the world.
Welcome to the debate review of what is widely considered the meeting of two of the greatest minds of the 21st century. I wish that statement was ironic, but sadly it's not, and it seems that a lot of people thought this was a very stimulating and thought-provoking conversation. This whole thing was over 2 hours long, so I will just be covering the part of the debate that pertains to education in this particular video. But if you happen to like what you hear in terms of review, go right ahead and tell me in the comments if you want to hear some more, or if you think I'm annoying and you hate my guts, feel free to go ahead and tell me that too. But without further ado, let's dive right in.
Ben, you're conservative. Destiny, you're a liberal. Can you each describe what key values underpin your philosophy on politics and maybe life in the context of this left-right political spectrum? You want to go first?
Yeah. So I think that we have a huge country full of a lot of people, a lot of individual talents, capabilities. And I think that the goal of government, broadly speaking, should be to try to ensure that everybody's able to achieve as much as possible. So on a liberal level, that usually means some people might need a little bit of a boost when it comes to things like education. They might need a little bit of a boost when it comes to providing certain necessities like housing or food or clothing. But broadly speaking, I mean, I'm still a liberal, not a communist or a socialist. I don't believe in the, total command economy, total communist takeover of all of the, economy. But I think that broadly speaking, the government should kind of like kick in and help people when they need it.
Destiny really tries to start out strong here with a sort of conservative values framing of his liberal policy positions. He says, I want to maximize human potential. Ordinarily, liberals and people on the left would appeal to popular senses of justice, fairness, and equality. But Destiny knows these are too amorphous, and he also knows that Ben will just dismiss him as this pie-in-the-sky idealistic dreamer instead of a credible, practical voice on the left, which I suspect is why he makes this I'm not a communist or a socialist disclaimer right here in the beginning. If he looks even slightly like he's putting feels over reals, then he knows Ben will just poke all kinds of holes in his values and say, hey, when the rubber hits the road, these fundamentally don't work. I have the mature, sensible, practical, pragmatic approach to politics. And this is also why Destiny has been so popular online, because there are a lot of people who are left-wing / center-left who don't feel like they have a pragmatic voice, and Destiny, for them, is that voice. And if you were to ask a person who is interested in political commentary who they feel is the left-wing counterpart to Ben Shapiro, they would likely say Destiny. They both love to play the role of rational, pragmatic, mature policy analyst. But what I think this debate will showcase is that Destiny is simply outclassed and outmatched. Ben Shapiro not only has greater institutional backing, he's spoken at CPAC as an example, so he's more of a recognized figure. He's also more competent in terms of his career as he runs his own media company, that being the Daily Wire, and he is also a trained lawyer. So Destiny really has an uphill battle on his hands here, and I say this as someone who is personally not a fan of Ben Shapiro by any means.
And that government can and should be big.
Not necessarily. I noticed that when liberals talk about government, or especially taxes, it seems like they talk about it for taxes' sake or bigness sake. So people talk about taxes sometimes as like a punishment, like tax the rich. I think taxing the rich is fine insofar as it funds the programs that we want to fund. But Democrats have a really big problem demonizing success or wealth, and I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing to be wealthy, to be a billionaire or whatever, as long as we're funding what we need to fund.
Destiny starts off already having to do damage control for the left. This is just not a good situation at all.
Ben, what do you think it means to be a conservative? What's the philosophy that underlies your political view?
So first of all, I'm glad that Destiny, you're already coming out as a Republican. That's exciting. We hold a lot in common in terms of, the basic idea that people ought to have as much opportunity as possible, and also insofar as the government should do the minimum amount necessary to interfere in people's lives in order to pursue certain functions, particularly at the local level.
Get ready for two people who are essentially just libertarians to duke it out.
So a lot of governmental discussions on a pragmatic level end up being discussions about where government ought to be involved, but also at what level government ought to be involved. And I have an incredibly subsidiary view of government. I think that local governments, because you have higher levels of homogeneity and consent, are capable of doing more things. And as you abstract up the chain, it becomes more and more impractical and more divisive to do more things. In my view, government is basically there to preserve certain key liberties. Those key liberties pre-exist the government insofar as they are more important than what priorities the government has. The job of government is to maintain, for example, national defense, protection of property rights, protection of religious freedom.
You'll also notice that Ben Shapiro gives a more ideologically robust defense of his positions on issues and is effectively able to corral Destiny in a way that Destiny just can't keep up with. Ben's philosophy and approach to politics and government is pragmatic, but is also grounded in clearer values, which I think ultimately serves him better, and he's able to dismiss Destiny multiple times throughout the debate as simply quibbling over policy. Ben is appealing to natural rights here when he talks about liberties that pre-exist government as opposed to legal rights. And Destiny is simply not as philosophically literate. He's just not as principled. And I say this as someone who would disagree with Ben and still reject the idea that natural rights exist in any meaningful sense.
Right? These are the key focuses of government as generally expressed in the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. And I agree with the general philosophy of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. Now, that doesn't mean, by the way, that you can't do more on a governmental level, again, as you get closer to the ground, which, by the way, is also embedded in the Constitution. People forget the Constitution was originally applied to the federal government, not to local and state governments. But if I were going to define conservatism, it would actually be a little broader than that, because I think to understand how people interact with government, you have to go to kind of core values. And so for me, there are a couple of premises. One, human beings have a nature. That nature is neither good nor bad. We have aspects of goodness and we have aspects of badness. Human beings are sinful. We have temptations. And what that means is that we have to be careful not to incentivize the bad, and that we should incentivize the good. Human beings do have agency and are capable of making decisions in the vast majority of circumstances. And it is better for society if we act as though they do. Second, the basic idea of human nature, there is an idea, in my view, that all human beings have equal value before the law. Yeah, I'm a religious person, so I'd say equal value before God, but I think that's also sort of a key tenet of Western civilization, being non-religious or religious, that every individual has equivalent value in sort of cosmic terms.
We don't get to hear Ben go more into it in this debate, but in my opinion, there are seedlings of absolute universal egalitarianism in what Ben just said here. I affirm that God is unapproachably distant from all human beings in terms of worth, and humanity is worthless relative to God, but I don't believe that every individual human is spiritually equal or of equal spiritual value.
But that does not necessarily mean that every person is equally equipped to do everything equally well. And so it is not the job of government to rectify every imbalance of life. The quest for cosmic justice, as Thomas Sowell suggests, is something that government is generally incapable of doing, and more often than not botches and makes things worse.
Ben is really just a standard bearer for basic Reaganite conservatism. It doesn't really seem like Destiny did his homework in preparing for this, though.
So those are a few key tenets, and that tends to materialize in a variety of ways. The easiest way to sum that up would the traditional kind of three legs of the conservative stool, although now obviously there's a very fragmented conservative movement in the United States, would be a socially conservative view in which family is the chief institution of society, like the little platoons of society, as Edmund Burke suggested, in which free markets and property rights are extraordinarily valuable and necessary, because every individual has the ability to be creative with their property and to freely alienate that property.
So this is Ben's response to how people ought to be set up to achieve as much as possible, and he defends it very doggedly and very consistently throughout the whole debate. And Destiny is just like this circling gadfly who's looking for an opening but can't pop his bubble. He can't find a gap in Ben's defenses. Destiny would have done better if he'd attacked the free market leanings that Ben has, because that's really the weakest leg of the conservative stool, as Ben put it. This isn't some sort of cottage industry situation where we can reasonably expect everyone to be their own boss and produce value all on their own, because they're competing with these incredibly sophisticated, complex, well-funded firms that span the country and have cornered the market. Good luck using your own property to start your own Carl's Jr. and Hardee's. You can't just do that anymore. It's not possible. And our economic policy should reflect that and should also still be able to set people up for success instead of just being cogs in a corporate machine or consigning them to wage slavery.
And finally, I tend toward a hawkish foreign policy that suggests that the world is not filled with wonderful people who all agree with us and think like us. And those people will pursue adversarial interests if we do not protect our own interests.
For the record, Destiny is ordinarily pretty hawkish himself, but just for the sake of this debate, or because it's what's popular on the left right now, he chooses to defend Palestine. Because I can recall not too long ago, he was very pro-Ukraine, pro-American empire.
Can I ask a question on that? I'm so curious.
Sure.
Okay. I'm excited for this conversation because I consider you to be really intelligent. But I feel like sometimes there are ways that conservatives talk about certain issues that seem to defy logic and reason, I guess. So here, and I'm sure you feel the same way about I feel the same way about progressives, but even some liberals for sure.
You see that smile on his face? Is Destiny simping for Ben? Is Destiny starstruck right now? He's met the debate god of facts and logic, and he's just got to acknowledge that. He's just got to pay him respect.
Before I ask this question, it's going to relate to education. We can agree, broadly speaking, that statistics are real and that not everybody could do everything. So for a grounded example, my life was pretty bad. I got into streaming and I turned my life around, and that was really cool, but I can't expect everybody to do what I did, right? Like everybody being able to join the NBA or to be like a streamer.
Well, of course, everybody has different qualities, sure.
Okay. So I used to be a lot more libertarian when I was 21. And one of the things that dramatically changed kind of my view on government manipulation of things in society came when it came time to deal with my son and the school that he went to. And one of the things that I noticed was when it came time to send my son to school, I could either do private education or I could do public.
Destiny is going to attempt to critique Ben's more conservative approach to capitalism through the issue of school choice, and it's just not going to be robust enough. Ben is going to deny him until he's basically begging for a bare minimum that already exists in pretty much every public school across the country.
Personally, I did 12 years of Catholic private education. However, the public schools in Nebraska, depending on where you lived, were very, very, very good. And I opted for a certain district. I bought a house there. I moved there. And then my son was able to go to those schools. And he's been going through those schools. And the difference of availability of like technology, like these kids are taking home iPads in like first grade. They've got like huge computer labs and everything.
Personally, I would not want my child coming home with an iPad. And if the school were to teach them anything about computers, I would want them to learn how to code or learn some other sort of marketable skill that involves computers, not just having the technology in and of itself. I don't think that really provides any use. Maybe that counts in terms of writing and submitting essays digitally, but then again, that also doesn't mean much if you're so poor that you don't have internet at home, which a lot of people don't.
Do you think that there is some type of, I don't want to say injustice or unfairness, because I'm not even looking at it that way, just pragmatically, that there might be children that are in certain schools that if they just had better funding or more access to technologies or things available to them, that those kids would become more productive members of society, that with like a little bit of a help, they could actually achieve more and do better for all of society?
So I think that on the list of priorities, when it comes to education, the availability of technology is actually fairly low on the list of priorities.
Sure. The two things I've heard are food availability and I think air conditioning, I think are the two biggest ones that I hear.
You can see here how Destiny seems to assume at first that they're going to be arguing on the same wavelength, like Ben would even really notice or respect those facts because Destiny thinks they're both masters of facts and logic, and that's something he looked up the day before the debate when he was preparing. But he doesn't anticipate that Ben actually has principles. And Ben is going to drag this back to an issue that's fundamentally more pressing and more important.
But sure.
Well, I mean, the biggest thing in terms of education itself, not just the physical facilities that we're talking about, would actually be two-parent family households.
Sure.
Communities that have fathers in them is actually the number one decisive, according to Roland Fryer and many studies done on this particular topic. And the idea that money alone, that investment of resources is the top priority in schooling is belied by the fact that LAUSD, which is where I went to school when I was younger, they pour an enormous amount of money into LAUSD. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars very often per student, and it does not result in better schooling outcomes.
So Ben just brings it back to the first leg of the conservative stool here, which is family, and then proceeds to just talk circles around Destiny.
And so when you say, if we could give every kid an iPad, would you give every kid an iPad? The question is not, if I had a replicator machine from Star Trek, would I give everybody an enormous amount of stuff? Sure, I would. Every resource is finite. Every resource is limited, and you have to prioritize what are the outcomes that you seek in terms of the means with which you are seeking them.
Mhm.
And so, again, I think that the question is I quibble with the premise of the question, which is that, again, the chief injustice when it comes to education on the list of injustices is lack of availability to technology, or that it's a funding problem. I just don't think that's the case.
Sure. And I can half agree with you there, but I don't think any amount of changes in the schools will create two-parent households, right? We can't bring it back.
I totally agree with you.
So
that's why I think that the fundamental educational problem is not, in fact, a schooling problem. I think that it pre-exists that.
Sure. But then I feel like this is kind of the conservative merry-go-round where it's like, what can we do to help with schools? So two of the things that I've seen, I think, that are usually brought up in research is one is air conditioning, that children in hotter environments just don't learn as well. And then the second one is access to food. So like kids that are given like a breakfast or a lunch that's provided at school, like increases educational outcomes.
We're beginning to see a little bit of the ideological struggle, or at least the branding struggle, pick up steam here, because Destiny is now going, this is the conservative merry-go-round, and I'm the true pragmatist because I'm actually concerned about doing something about schools, while you're making it this sort of merry-go-round thing where you're not actually addressing the issue and then just gesturing at another issue. But Ben is not going to take that accusation lying down.
Now, I agree that neither of these things might be determinative in like, 20% of kids were graduating and now 80% of kids are graduating, or these kids are all going, from with their GEDs into the workforce and now these kids are all suddenly becoming engineers. But in terms of where we can help, do you think there should be like some minimum threshold or minimum baseline of like, at the very least, every school should have a non-leaky gym, or every school should have, if children can't afford lunch or breakfast, like some sort of food provided, or every school should have these like baseline things?
So again, I'm going to quibble with the premise of the question, because I think that when it comes to, for example, food insecurity, school food programs, again, you can always pour money into any program and at the margins create change. I mean, there's no doubt that pouring money onto anything will create change in a marginal way. The question is, how large is the margin and how big is the movement, right? So the delta is what I'm looking at. And so I think that you're starting at a second order question, which is, what if we ignore what I would think are the big primary questions of education, namely family structure, value of education at home, how much you have parents who are capable or willing to help with homework, what are the incentive structures we can set up for a society that actually facilitate that, how local communities take ownership of their schools is a big one, right? All of these issues we're ignoring in favor of, say, air conditioning or lunch programs. And so in a vacuum, if you say air conditioning and lunch programs, sounds great in a vacuum. In terms of prioritization of values and cost structure, are those the things that I think are going to move the needle in a major way in terms of public policy? I do not. And in fact, I think that many of them end up being disproportionate wastes of money.
Ben just reasserts his dominance and says, this isn't going to help anything. You have no perspective, and pushes Destiny back into that sort of idealist box, with which is how the right characterizes the left, in saying that, all else being held equal, this might work, but then there are bigger issues at hand which you're not paying attention to. You can't just throw money at problems and expect them to go away.
I mean, I've talked before, pretty controversially, about the fact that an enormous amount of school lunch programs are thrown out. Like, an enormous amount of that food ends up in the garbage can. Is there a better way to do that? If there is a better way to do it, then I'm perfectly willing to hear about that better way to do it. But it seems to me that one of the big flaws in the way that many people of the left approach government is, what if we hit every gnat with a hammer? And my question is, what if the gnat isn't even the problem? What if there is a much bigger substructure problem that needs to be solved in order to, if you're shifting deck chairs on the Titanic, sure, you can make the Titanic slightly more balanced because the deck chairs are slightly better oriented. But the real question is the water that's gaping into the Titanic, right?
The left is also not pro-family at all. So Destiny doesn't really have a good response to what Ben just said, other than to redouble his efforts and double down and basically bring back the conservative merry-go-round trope. Because what the left wants, but then won't really admit, is for the state to step in and disrupt parental authority. Specifically, patriarchal paternal authority. So they're never going to address the root cause of these issues of children struggling in public schools, which is the dissolution of the patriarchal family structure. They're more willing to just consign that to the dustbin of history and say, oh, that was just a vestige of an era where our culture had pre-progressive values.
Yeah, and I agree with you 100%. But again, I feel like we're on the conservative merry-go-round then of never wanting to address
That's not a
any.
conservative merry-go-round. I can give you 10 ways.
Well, sure, but so like here would be the merry-go-round. I would say that like there is a minimum funding for schools that I think would help children, and then we go, well, the thing that would help them the most is two-parent households. And I go, okay, well, two-parent households actually aren't the problem. The issue is access to things like birth controls, that people don't have children early on. And it's like, but the issue isn't actually birth control. The issue is actually you need a certain amount of money to move out early and to get married, and then to have a two-parent household. So it's actually like economic opportunity.
No.
Well, it's not.
No, just two-parent households. That's
yeah,
it.
but like, what are the precursors?
Don't fuck people before you're married and have babies.
Sure.
Done.
Now should have been the point at which Destiny really hammered home that point about economic opportunity, because that's something Americans are very obviously in need of, but was done away with through free trade policies like NAFTA, moving all these jobs overseas. But Destiny's not like a leftist populist with protectionist or economic nationalist leanings like, say, old school Bernie Sanders was, because that would mean he would be advocating for something that would be at least halfway useful to America's interests. And Destiny is not about that. He's just about grifting. He's about whatever policy or position he believes will serve him in the moment. That's why he really has no core beliefs or philosophy.
That's great. We can say that and try to fight against, however many hundreds of thousands of years of human evolution, but people will have sex and people will make babies.
And then they used to get married. The vast majority of people in this country with kids used to be married. The vast majority of people with kids in this country now are not married increasingly. That
But
is
a lot of
obviously a
the-
societal change.
Yeah,
Something
true.
changed. It wasn't human evolution.
But a lot of those things in terms of resting on whether or not people get married have to do with financial decisions. Do you have the money?
People are worse off now than they were 50, 60 years ago when the marriage rates were higher.
People are delaying the start of their careers because education is becoming increasingly important.
So in other words, people are richer now and they have more education now, and yet they're having more babies out of wedlock now because they're richer and have more education.
I'm saying that
Ben did a very good job of making Destiny sound stupid there.
one of the biggest indicators for whether or not somebody's willing to get married is how much money both people are making if they can move out of their household. People don't tend to want to get married at 22 when they've just finished college, when they don't have the money to move out and they can't afford a house.
Because we have changed the moral status of marriage in the culture, meaning that everyone, poor, rich, and in between, used to get married. That is, by the way, a huge percentage of marriages in the United States used to be what they would call shotgun marriages, meaning that somebody knocked somebody up, and because they did not want the baby to be born outside of a two-parent household, they would then get married.
Do we think that shotgun marriages, though, are a way to bring back equilibrium to education?
Yes.
That if we,
Yes, absolutely. Yes, 100%.
Do we
a
think
child
that-
deserves a mother and a father?
Sure,
Because that
but-
is the basis for all of this, including education.
do we think that shotgun marriages are, well, let's say this, do we think that that's a reasonable direction that society would ever take? Or is this like,
Yes, it was the reasonable direction for nearly all of modern history.
but history moves in one direction, right?
Why?
Because of time?
I mean, people don't think that's in what way is that?
Is and I don't think we've ever regressed
yes,
social standards back to like, oh well, let's go 100 years back and do things that used to exist before. I
That's
think
weird.
things
The
like-
entire left right now is arguing that we regress social standards by rejecting Roe versus Wade. So that's obviously not true.
The solution to this problem Destiny's proposing here is terrible. He's basically saying, oh, well, we're never going to hold people to those standards again, so we might as well just start throwing money at problems. And this doesn't work in the very long term because eventually you have this situation where so many people are dependent upon this infrastructure of the state that it all comes crashing down. Your system is so used to enfeebling people and not actually solving the root cause of family structure, so you end up with a country that just ceases to produce productive people. Do I think conservatives will win the culture war? No. But do I think the answer is pouring fuel on the fire of the welfare state that helped caused the situation that we're in? Also no. Ben is also kind of backhandedly mocking Destiny here by pointing out that the left is always screaming and crying about how Republicans, conservatives, the right, generally speaking, are like a hair's breadth away from undoing literally all social progress and sending the whole country back into the dark ages. Destiny is a tricky guy, though, and he's going to attempt to use this mockery to his advantage by sort of taking it seriously. Just watch.
The Roe versus Wade is not a social standard; it's a Supreme Court ruling. Number
Yes,
one.
but
Number
then-
two, if you read the actual majority opinion on Roe v. Wade, we can see that socially we actually never made huge progress on how society viewed abortion. This has always been an incredibly divisive thing, right? Even that was, I think, part of Alito's writing on it was that things like gay marriage, for instance, we've kind of moved past, and it's not really as debated anymore. But abortion was never a settled topic, despite Roe v. Wade.
The
despite
notion that
Casey.
the arc of history constantly moves in one direction is belied by nearly all of the 20th century.
It is a weakness of the conservative movement that social conservatives do not control or shape the culture in really any meaningful way. There have been notable conservative victories, but the left, the new left specifically, has gained tremendous ground since, say, 1970 or even 2010 in normalizing whatever they want to normalize. So Ben has to step in, refocus the conversation, and attack this assumption that Destiny has made, which is that social progress is unidirectional and more or less linear.
What do we mean by that?
I mean,
In
the
terms
first
of,
half
like,
of the
women's
20th
rights,
century is
civil
filled with
rights?
barbarism, communism, Nazism. All of that was a regression from what was happening at, for example, the beginning of the 19th century and the 20th century.
In what way?
Nazism and communism weren't a regression from what was going on in 1905.
These are, in terms of like communism being a regression, for instance, I'm not a communist, but like the industrialization of the Soviet Union happened under a communist society. The industrialization,
the murder of tens of millions of people.
Yeah, there's
I consider that a regression. A moral regression, which is what we are talking about now, moral regression. And you're suggesting that moral regression, I wouldn't term a return to traditional values a moral regression. You would. But your suggestion is that history only moves in one direction. And I'm suggesting that history does not only move in one direction. It tends to move actually back and forth.
Sure. I don't think that all of history moves in one direction. There are going to be wars. There are going to be times of peace. I think in general, we're more peaceful now than we have been in the past.
This is just not true when you look at the scale of destruction of the First and Second World War. These are two of the biggest wars. These are literally the biggest wars in human history, as well as tons of other conflicts that were going on all throughout the 20th century. This is unironically one of the deadliest times to be alive in human history. People are just historically ignorant and insulated from it, so we just don't know any better.
But I think when we look at the way that people live their lives, I think that we tend to move in a certain direction socially. So when it comes to things like racism, or when it comes to things like slavery or women's rights, I think that there are two huge things that probably aren't changing in the US, and one is access to contraception, and one is women working jobs. I think that these two things are probably huge things that are moving us off of shotgun marriages or getting married very early on. And I don't see those. Do you think that those two things are going to change fundamentally?
First of all, what the data tend to show is that actually more highly educated people, as you were saying, tend to get married more. So if the idea is that women getting an education somehow throws them off marriage, it's the opposite. Usually,
those women
aren't
not
educated.
But those women aren't getting shotgun marriages. Those women aren't having children.
Yeah,
when
but
they're
now
18,
you're
17.
shifting the topic. My topic was how to get more people married, and what I'm and then you suggested that higher levels of education are delaying marriage and making it less probable. And what I'm telling you, because this is what the data suggests, is that actually, as you raise up the educational ladder, people tend to be married more than they are lower down on the educational ladder. If you're a high school graduate, you're less likely to be married than if you're a postdoc.
I think Indians, East Asians, and Jewish people are the three groups that would probably contribute most to this statistic, but don't quote me on that. So you have these STEM nerds who live very disciplined, socially conservative personal lives who are set up to be the most successful in our society at the moment.
I agree with you, but that's because one of the biggest precursors to getting married is having like a level of economic stability. So as people get more educated, they obtain this economic stability, and then they're in a more comfortable position to explore more serious relationships.
There's another confound there. I mean, the confound is that people in stable marriages tend to be the children of stable marriages. And there's only one way to break that cycle, which is to create a stable marriage. And that is something that is in everyone's hands. Again, this notion that it is somehow an unbreakable, unshatterable barrier to get married and have kids, I don't understand where this is coming from. Why is that such a challenge?
I don't think it's unbreakable or unshatterable. The initial point was for school.
You can see exposed here how Destiny doesn't really want to change cultural messaging that people receive so that people are encouraged to actually make healthy, responsible choices with their lives. This is why he's got to pump the brakes and walk back his statements.
If we can provide a minimum level of educational stuff for children, that'd probably be good. But when we retreat back to, well, it has to be the families that are fixed first, fixing families is a multivariate problem that has so many different...
I am fine. Within my local community, we all vote. Again, I've suggested that there's a difference between local community and federal. I'm fine with my local community voting for school lunches or air conditioning or whatever it is that we all agreed to do, because the more local you get, the more homogeneity you get in terms of interest and the more interest you have in your neighbors.
I think a typical leftist rejoinder here would have been, what if you're part of a community that has like no capital at all and is just terrible, like Detroit, and you've been, failing for like 2 or 3 generations at this point? Like, what do you do then? Or somewhere in West Virginia. Destiny actually makes this point a little while later, but I think it just shows to the fact that he's already not that confident, and I think he's lost his footing, that he doesn't break in here and make that point.
All of that's fine. I'm part of a very, very solid community. In our community, we give to each other. We have minimum standards of helping one another. All of that's wonderful. When it comes to the actual problem of education, what I object to in the political sphere, and this happens all the time, is everybody is arguing on top of the iceberg about how we can move the needle 0.5 percentage points, as opposed to the entire iceberg melting beneath them. And we just ignore that. And we pretend that that's just, sort of the natural consequence of things. The arc of history suggests that people are never going to get married again. Well, I mean, actually, what the arc of history suggests, realistically speaking, is that the people who are not getting married are not going to be having kids. And what it also suggests, the people who are married are going to be having kids. And so the demographic profile actually over time is rather going to shift toward people who are having lots and lots of kids. I'm married. I have 4 kids. Everyone in my community is married. It's like minimum buy-in in my community is 4 kids. Okay. And so what's happening actually in terms of demographics is that the people who are more religious and getting married are having more kids.
You basically have to be part of an insular fundamentalist religious community to really reap that benefit. At this point, Orthodox Jews and Amish people, as examples, their population basically doubles every 20 years. So you really do need high group cohesion and a very strong sense of identity in order to effectively pull that off.
And so if you're talking about the arc of history shifting toward marriage, I would suggest that actually demographically over time, long periods of time, not over one generation, over long periods of time, the only cure for low birth rate is going to be the people who get married and have lots of kids.
As an aside here, having communities like these perpetuate themselves into modernity is pretty hard. They're kind of delicate now because there are masses and masses of people who've chosen to live less healthy and less productive lives who can just vote their will onto you. Whatever stupid dysgenic thing they want to do, they can just increasingly vote to disincentivize healthy, productive, constructive behavior.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree with any of that, but I'm just saying that, again, I know you're upset when I bring up the term merry-go-round. I think that there are good conversations to be had about people getting married because stable families produce stable children that are less likely to commit crime, that are more likely to go to school, that are more likely to be productive members of society, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to disagree with you on any of that. All of that is true. It's just frustrating that sometimes when you bring up any problem, all of it will circle back to other things that makes it seem like we can't make any progress in any area without fixing
in
something.
In what way? I mean, I literally just told you that on the local level, I'm fine for people voting for air conditioning.
Yeah, but so for instance, on the local level, so for school funding is done, I think, generally per district. So what do you do when you have poor districts that can't afford air conditioner for their schools?
I mean, the idea there would be that presumably if the society, meaning the state, and I generally don't mean the federal state, I mean like the state of California, for example, decides that everybody ought to have air conditioning, people will vote for air conditioning, and that's perfectly legal. And I don't think there's anything morally objectionable about that per se.
Cool.
I also don't think that that's going to heal anything remotely like the central problem.
Sure,
and I think that what tends to happen in terms of government is people love arguing about the problems that can be solved by opening a wallet, and nobody likes to solve a problem by, closing their sex life.
And then Ben proceeds to walk him right back to the same answer he gave Destiny earlier. And Destiny is nodding and agreeing the whole time. He makes a concession. He says, I'm fine with, say, the state of California doing that, but fundamentally, it's still not going to solve their problems.
To one person, for example, or having kids within a stable religious community, like the things that actually build society. I'm fine with arguing about each of these policies. And sure, whether we apply them or not is a matter generally of pragmatism, not morality. It's a matter of incentive structures, not per se morality. Because incentive structures do have moral underpinnings. There's such a thing as, for example, if you're going to use a welfare program, you have to decide how effective it is, to what crowd it applies, where the cutoffs are. Does it disincentivize work? Does it not? Yeah. All of these are pragmatic concerns. But on a moral level, the generalized objection that I have to people on the left side of the aisle is that they like to focus in these conversations. Very often it feels as though it's a conversation with people who are drunk searching under the lamp for their keys.
And you have the real contention of the two narratives here. And Destiny is simply not able to articulate this narrative in a way that gets Ben to trip or stumble over himself and make him look bad, basically. Destiny is sort of willing to hint at his narrative, but then not truly invoke it in a confident way by saying, this is the conservative merry-go-round. Like, he's suggesting that people on the right, Republicans, are unserious about solving problems and are basically evil, greedy, rich white people who cloak their contempt for the rest of the country, the unwashed masses, in claims that whatever policies will whatever public spending policies you could use to marginally improve people's lives are just fiscally irresponsible because they don't want a dime of their money going to taxes to pay for these people who they feel are beneath them, supposedly. And Destiny is just not willing to make that kind of an argument in a bold, attention-grabbing way in this arena against Ben.
The problems they want to look at are the problems that are solvable by government.
Mm-hmm.
And then all the problems they don't want to look at, which are the actual giant monsters lurking in the dark and not particularly solvable by government, are the ones they want to ignore and assume are just the natural state of things. And I don't think that's correct at all.
And I 1,000,000,000% agree. And then obviously my criticism for the conservative side is the exact opposite, where there are parts where government could remedy some issues. For instance, children having sex with each other and producing other children out of wedlock. Like sometimes having after school programs is nice to prevent that. Like I didn't have time for these things when I was in school. I was doing football practice. I was doing cross country practice. I went in early for a band, I agree with you that sometimes people only focus on one end of the problem. I hate to be that guy, but as somebody that, have you ever watched The Wire?
Sure.
I'm not going to cite The Wire as a real life example, but like obviously there's only so much you can do in a school when the children coming in are so beyond destroyed because of the family life and everything prior to them even getting to school that day. So I agree. Government is not like the solution to broken families. That would never be the case.
And it's actually not the solution to education, depending on the kind of solutions that you're talking about. Some solutions, yes. Some solutions, no.
Yeah.
So
the only thing I'm looking at is, as I said earlier, just like these minimum threshold things where it's like, where can government make, because you mentioned marginal, which I think is a really good way to look at things. There's marginal cost and marginal utility to things where the first $1,000 per student you spend might give you a huge return, but the extra $20,000 after is just
I think these are all pragmatic discussions.
Sure, of course. Okay.
Actually, this is what we used to hash out in legislatures before they turned into platforms for people grandstanding. But yes.
Sure. Okay, yeah.
See how I told you earlier, if you remember, how he's basically begging now, just the minimum threshold, And Ben's like, fine, that's reasonable. We can quibble over policy some other time. Very effectively shut down Destiny. Ben is, again, a trained lawyer, not just some other person on the internet who hasn't even participated in a high school debate class. Like Destiny is outclassed and outmatched. Anyway, that's it for this video. If you want me to review more of this debate, just let me know in the comments. If this video is successful and enough people comment that, then I'll do it. And other than that, Red Channels will catch you in the next one.